The disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi has sparked global tensions with the U.S. demanding answers. There's also concerns over how this situation will impact the Middle East. For more on this, we want to bring in CBSN contributor Gabe Lipton. He writes for Signal, a newsletter produced by GZERO Media. Gabe, thanks for being here.
Great to be with you.
Let's just start off with why Khashoggi may have been a target of Saudi Arabia.
So Khashoggi had been, in the past year, increasingly a big critic of Crown Prince Salman for what he saw as a turn towards repression in Saudi Arabia. Crown Prince Salman has, in sort of the last year or two, pushed massive reforms in the country, from allowing women to drive to passing an anti-harassment law. But at the same time, he's also cracked down on dissent. So he's arrested, and he did arrest many of Khashoggi's friends, and increasingly, and also shut down his newspaper that he was working for in Riyadh. And so, as explained, Khashoggi had left to the U.S. He'd fled to the U.S. He was writing for the Washington Post and talking a lot about this sort of perhaps more sinister side of the Crown Prince's reform efforts. He had come back to Saudi. He came back to Turkey to work, and this terrible incident happened at the embassy. But I think it's because he was sort of this open and vocal critic of the Crown Prince that we saw this happen. I think the question is, why did the Crown Prince do this at this time? For this to happen, as it's described by the Turks, the Crown Prince Salman had to have at least known about it, if not had actually ordered that he be killed. So this is a big, big moment in Saudi Arabia, and it tells us a lot about the Crown Prince's own thinking and the direction of the country.
So, Gabe, Turkey also cracks down on journalists. What's it like for them in that region?
Yeah, I think the big contradiction here, we see this growing conflict between Turkey and Saudi Arabia over this murder, or what Turkey is saying is the murder of Mr. Khashoggi. But Turkey itself is probably the world's biggest, at least over the last year, repressor of journalists. It has arrested thousands and thousands of journalists in its own country. President Erdogan has lambasted the free media. And in Saudi Arabia, too, we've seen a crackdown on the media as Crown Prince Salman has undertaken this reform effort. So we're seeing this clash of two countries. Turkey is really motivated by, not by a sort of love for the freedom of the press, but what it sees as an attack on its own soil, right? An attack on its sovereignty.
So how is this affecting the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Turkey? Because this mystery has rattled the entire region.
Right. This is, Saudi Arabia and Turkey have never been close allies. There are many points of friction between the two countries. The Turks are very close with Iran, which they see as a natural ally. Saudi Arabia has always viewed very skeptically sort of Turkey's traditional secular democratic rule. It's a theocracy. They are very different in terms of how they view governance. So they have always been natural foes. But I think this escalates, this exacerbates the sort of traditional tensions between the two countries. And I think what we have to watch very closely over the next week is how the Turkish government reacts. I think part of what we'll have to watch for is what the actual investigations into what's happened, what they tell us. The details are still very murky.
And then there's the possible U.S. involvement. We heard from U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo calling for a transparent investigation. What's at stake if the U.S. gets involved here?
So it's hard to see the U.S. actually hitting back at Saudi Arabia very hard. Donald Trump took his first state visit to Saudi Arabia. He has pushed the U.S. much closer to Saudis, and there is actually currently no U.S. ambassador in Riyadh. So I think the fact that the Crown Prince has taken this step suggests he thinks there's a certain level of impunity, that he can get away with this, that there aren't consequences for what is a state-sanctioned murder of a journalist, right? The fact that he's taken this action tells us a lot about him, and I think the U.S. response I view as very tepid so far. The Trump administration said they hope there's some conclusion to this, but we haven't seen any concrete steps to really lash out or hit back at Saudi Arabia, and I don't think that more will be forthcoming.